So what is a sign? Well, Morris tells us then in his work that, and I quote, that signs, at least at the human level, do frequently generate a series of sign processes. But I see no reason why this fact about signs should be incorporated into the definition of the sign. So once again, we go back, we revert to the idea that Morris had issue with the recurrence of the sign being part of the definition. So what, he said, so what? If the sign is recurring, then so what? How does this contribute to the definition? And he said it doesn't, and we shouldn't. And Peirce did, but we shouldn't include this in the definition, said Morris. So Morris did not intend to define the sign, and we spoke about this before. His intention was not to define the sign, despite that he had problems with the definition of the sign, but basically to establish situations in which something is or may be recognized as a sign, and hence the divisions and everything that we will get to in a little. Okay, so mediation then. On the one hand, Morris he sought sign processes in a wide range of mediation processes, and on the other hand, he was convinced that mediation processes did not always involve signs. So there was that tension between searching for mediation everywhere, and then at the same time, simultaneously, he was convinced that mediation was not always involving of signs, and vice versa. Mediation was not always involved in signs, in the sign process. And he formulated that the sign processes mediating as interpretants are not omnipresent. Peirce was also somebody who had come up with that as well, and Morris agreed to this restriction and specification of sign and mediation, that mediation is not omnipresent. Okay, so then the connection between the sign and mental processes, said Morris, is that they syn-identify. They identify with each other. The sign and mental processes are always there. And if you recall, Jacques Lacan and Freud were proponents of this idea that mental processes are the sign. The sign is what the mental process is all about. And Jacques Lacan moved this on to linguistics, and he said that the brain works, the internal workings of the brain are like a language, meaning, not it is a language, but are like a language, meaning that the significations that happen in language happen in the brain, and this is how the brain works, said Jacques Lacan. And Freud also said a very similar thing. So Morris then tells us that the sign processes and mental processes syn-identify, they identify with each other, and therefore sign processes are not restricted to behavioral or actional situations alone, but they concern all the processes. And therefore, sign processes are not restricted to behavioral or actional situations alone, but refer to or apply to a universal set of situations. Okay. So let's now look at a quick look at his framework. I guess, a very, very quick and general overview of his life's works framework. And his social behavior. Well, Morris told us that this language is defined by rules, and these rules govern combinations, signification, and origin uses, and the effects of sign. And he told us that language is the system of signs that produce dispositions to social behavior. So to understand the uses and effects of signs, then we must understand the influence, and this is very important, the influence of signs on social behavior. Otherwise, and the influences, so the subtleties of influence on social behavior by the signs, and hence we can understand the uses and the effects of signs. And these were the situations that Morris then expanded on throughout his tenure as a philosopher and semiotician and everything. In pragmatism, said Morris, there was a difference between behaviorism and mentalism, and the terms of pragmatism may differ between behaviorism and mentalism. And he suggested that behaviorist theory may hold that signs denote responses or dispositions to behavior, but at the same time, mentalist theory may hold that signs denote concepts or ideas. So, you know, in behaviorist theory, signs denote a process and action. In mentalist theory, signs denote ideas and what happens in the mind, or the static elements of the mind. But Morris's theory of behavioral semiotics did not attempt to reconcile behaviorism and mentalism, ironically, but it attempted to provide a more accurate and precise terminology to develop the science of signs. So, you know, that's a very general framework of what he's done. And to define signification then, I guess, as the final part of, you know, introducing Morris, to define signification, Morris defined signification, or the significatum, and we will see the connection between these two in a little. Morris defines signification as a set of conditions under which the sign denotes something. If the sign denotes something, Morris tells us, if the sign denotes something, the response sequences are completed by the interpreter. And similarly, sign vehicles with the same significator belong to the same sign family, where each member of the sign family prepares the interpreter to initiate the same response sequences to its denotatum or denotator, since each sign has the same signification. He goes on to tell us that a sign with more than one signification can belong to more than one family. So, you know, if there's one signification, which there never is really, but if there's one signification, then, you know, it's in one family, but the more significations you have, the more diverse its membership can be in the set of significated families. However, signs similar in denotation conditions are also similar in significator, and, you know, you can easily find analogy there in in characteristics. So characteristics, if I speak one language, if I speak English, then I'm in an English-speaking community, but if I speak Spanish and Japanese and German and Swahili, then I become a member of various communities, and more than that, because, you know, there are languages that bridge the two of these languages, three of these languages, like Swahili and English. Yeah, I don't know if you know the language of Sheng, but Sheng is a very interesting sociolect, and something I'm very interested in. And it's a mixture of Swahili and English, and the social motives for developing this are very interesting, and they get very social-political, and we hope to discuss that in future sessions. Okay, so let us now move on to the beginning of our discussion of the work of Charles Morris, and we can start with sign components, and I guess this is the best place to start because, you know, his work was all about signs, or mostly about signs, and this is what he bridged his work. So if you look at the diagram now, so this is what bridged his work to people before him. So if you look at the diagram now, we see the original Persian diagram that we worked on, and it's a triangle, and the triangle has at the bottom left, at the lower left, the object. At the lower right, we see the appearance, and at the top, we see the effect or the interpretant. So Morris took the object and the idea of the object, the representamen, and he suggested that this is a sign vehicle, or the object or event which functions as a sign. then he took the appearance and he defined this as a designatum, or a kind of object or class of objects that signs designate, and then the interpretant at the top, which first defined as the situated aspect of the sign. It's the way in which the sign becomes situated in our very situated cognition. Morris tells us that this is the interpreter, or the person for whom the sign vehicle functions as a sign, and then we get the interpretant. The disposition of the interpreter to initiate responses or a response sequence after perceiving the sign. So this is the disposition after which then we have a new response sequence, and and on and on and on and on and on. So comparing the two, we have on the left we have the Peircean three components, and at the top we have the representamen, which is A, the semiotic object, which is B, the convention, and then the interpretant, which is the situated understanding of the semiotic object, or the representamen. However, for Morris, there were four. There was the sign vehicle, the designatum, and then the interpretant and interpreter. Okay, so the sign then, in Morris's work in Signification and Significance of 1964, his book, published in 1964, he systematically relates sign theory and value theory. And of course, value theory was very important in determining or expanding on the sign. And here he connected semiotics and what we call axiology. Okay, so the value. So in the book then, he underlines the ambiguity, or he emphasizes the ambiguity of meaning, covering intention, signification, and value. So, of course, there's signification in the middle, and then intention, which precedes signification, and then value, which succeeds or moves on from signification. And he shows us in the work, and I guess the connected work, he shows us that the nature of meaning is adequately understood through developed semiotics and not vice versa. So there he starts to look at the nature of meaning, and of course this becomes very ontological, the nature of being, the nature of meaning, very philosophical. So this is where he increasingly connects semiotics to philosophy, and hence his fame or his prominence as a philosopher. So then in doing the work on values and connecting values to semiotics, Morris classifies values as three: as an object, as an operative, and as the conceived. And these are just terms now, and we're going to get back to these and discuss these after we get past the periphery, because we're still at the very periphery of Morris. If not semiotics, if not linguistic anthropology, we're still at the very, very periphery. And we have so much to do, and so much work to be done on this. Hence the ongoing meetings. Okay. So this became then an operational or very pragmatic attitude towards the cognitive object, and this, he said, demystifies the role assigned to definition. Okay, so employing a pragmatic attitude would somehow reduce or alleviate the role that definition had taken on. So Morris then, going back to what we said before, reinforced the fact that the intention wasn't to define the object in its condition of knowability and how we know the object, but rather to look at the situations and the environments in which we deal with signs. So not to so much define the sign and to know what a sign is, but rather to look at the conditions under which signs occur and where they appear in certain forms and manifestations. He then tells us that if the values are considered to be in relation to action and preferential behavior, then the study of action is inevitable when we pass from sign theory to value theory, where values are objectively relative properties and also at the same time properties of objects which are relative to some sort of preferential behavior. Okay, so the terminological innovations Morris introduced for semiotics and semiosis. First of all, the sign or sign vehicle, which is an object that acts as a stimulus for the sign behavior. As Saussure did and as Peirce did, he introduced and redefined this idea of the sign or sign vehicle. The interpreter, which is an organism acted upon by the sign vehicle. The interpretant, which is the disposition to respond to the type of object of sign stimulus. Signification is the object to which the interpreter responds through the interpretant. And that is a signified object which cannot function simultaneously as a stimulus. And last of all, the context, which is the circumstance within which signification occurs. Then we come to defining some of these things, and this is significant in Morris's division of labor. So if you look at the diagram, we see at the top the S, there's an S at the top, and this is split into two, and D, which represents the relationship between the sign form and its designatum or denotatum, which is the focus of semantics, and this D, which is an object for which the sign vehicle stands, is then split into two, the designatum and the denotatum. We have the I, which represents the relationship between the sign form and the interpretant, which is the focus of pragmatics. So the I is then separated into two, the interpretant and the interpreter. On the left, we have the interpretant, and the interpretant is the taking account of that goes along with understanding the effect of S on some agent who perceives it. So the interpretant is the taking account of that accompanies the understanding of the effect of S on some agent who perceives this effect. However, the interpreter is, of course, the agent. So we spoke before a little about axiology. In fact, we really just touched on it briefly, just to indicate that Morris was doing work on axiology, and we intend to enter into a discussion of Morris and his axiology later on. But in doing so, we can now very briefly introduce Morris's intention, and that he avoided, as he did avoid a defining signification, despite that he suggested that the definition of signification requires articulation. He avoided employing the term meaning as a synonym for signification. And he thought that the two were quite different, since meaning is ambiguous and may refer to other things, as designator, denotator, interpretant, or significator, and so forth. So he didn't synonymize meaning and signification. And he told us that various sign processes may define the meaning of the sign, and so there's no way we can actually use the word meaning as to be the same as signification. So then he intended to avoid ambiguity of using the word meaning and in signification, and he suggested that to do this we require a greater specificity or articulation in terms to define the components of semiosis, and in this way we can better understand how meaning differs to signification and how we can separate the two and then better describe semiosis. Okay, so now we move on to Morris's theory of signs, and this was the central core of his work over the years, his theory of signs. And this was really what his work was based around, of course. So in defining the sign, and of going back to what we've quoted a few times so far, and I quote Morris here, Morris tells us that signs, at least at the human level, do frequently generate a series of sign processes. But I see no reason why this fact about signs should be incorporated into the definition of the sign itself. And again, Morris tells us that there's this repetition, this ongoing cyclic sign after sign after sign. But why should this be the definition of the sign? Of course, you know, we have society, and there are 20, 30, 50, 10,000 people in a certain society, but how would this define the actual person? So Morris, again, he did not intend to define the sign, but rather to establish situations in which something may be recognized as a sign. So how did Morris define the sign? And well, he didn't define the sign, but he defined aspects of the sign. And first of all, Morris defines that the sign is a preparatory stimulus. So he defines the sign as a preparatory stimulus for the interpreter to respond to a non-stimulus. He explains how the semiotic develops within a science of behavior. And then he explains the role of semiotics in unifying biological, psychological, social, and humanistic sciences. He grounds the sign in describing it as having various aspects, having various components, including the syntactic, the semantic, and the pragmatic relations that occur within the sign. And we will move on to this very soon and speak about these three classifications in one of his divisions. And he spoke about these in reference to both linguistic and non-linguistic signs, so both linguistic and non-linguistic signs, which ultimately influence behavior. So these signs, or these three aspects, definitely influence behavior somehow, and we act on these, and hence this becomes a pragmatics or pragmaticism of the sign. Okay, he introduced a terminology to describe sign phenomena. He introduced quite an extensive set of terminologies. He also presented a theory of signs, which we have begun to look at and which we will expand on in time, which define the signs as stimuli to patterns of behavior. And again, we keep going back, we keep reverting to behavior, patterns of behavior, because this was, of course, a central concern for Morris. He explained that the developments of semiotics are within a context of the science of behavior. And, you know, when we look at Foucault and Derrida and we start to discuss science and what science means, we'll remember that we spoke about Morris and his science of behavior and everything, and we'll begin to refute that. But that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter now. What's important is that we understand Morris and we understand structuralism quite well, and then we move on. Okay, so by examining a science of signs for Morris in language, he decided that language is governed by these three areas. It is governed by syntax, by semantics, and pragmatics. And what do these three mean? Well, you know, we will definitely move on to these in due course, definitely. And the substantial amount of resource we will give to these will be there in due course. We just need to get around to it, and which we cannot for a while. Okay, so hence he created a triadic study of semiotics. It was Morris who really nailed it. And he said, okay, so semiotics is about these three things. It's about syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. These three fields. And hence bloomed field of the science of linguistics into syntax, semantics, and pragmatics, which are, of course, together with other fields, very important in current studies. academic studies of linguistics. Semantics. Semantics is the study of the relation of signs to objects to which they apply. And through semantics, we determine the conditions of signification. Syntax. Syntax is the study of the interrelation of signs without regard to meaning. Okay, so meaning is not that important, but what kind of meaning are we talking about here? What kind of meaning? You know, this is also quite ambiguous, and we're going to discuss this later. However, syntax studies the interrelation of signs, the interrelation, how they're related, how they become related. Okay, whether it's language, whether it's social behavior, whether it's cognition, whether it's music and the way that a musical piece is put together, or a DJ set, the way the DJ puts all the songs together, the syntax of the DJ set, without regard to meaning. But again, you know, it's something that we're not going to really be very rigid about, because suggesting that syntax, the elements of syntax do not have meaning is wrong. It's a very dangerous thing to say. No problem. Not important now. Okay, and syntax also determines the combinations and permutations of signs that function as grammatical statements. Pragmatics is the study of the relation between the sign system and its producers and interpreters, and how the sign system actually motivates a reaction from producers and interpretants, and determines conditions for the sign vehicle functioning. So then, in his work, The General Theory of Signs, we see three parts to the work. Three parts. There's a part 1, and a part 2, and a part 3. And part 1 was, I guess, in 1938, his text, The Foundations of the Theory of Signs, which was the early first part. It was the foundations, and you know, that's a pretty cool name for the first part, because it's the first part, right? You know, counterintuitive. And this discusses the dimensions of semiosis. It grounds semiosis, and discusses also semiotics as a method of investigation in all different fields, all these different sciences, such as linguistics, philosophy, sociology, anthropology, psychology, and so forth. Okay. Part 2 was, I guess, manifested itself in signs, language, and behavior. His text it was during the war, wasn't it, 1946, and Semi-Association War, 1946, okay. And this discusses the relations between linguistic science and social behavior, so he's starting to make connections here, okay, between linguistic science and social behavior. And it examines, I guess it does four things. It discusses the connections between linguistic action and social behavior. It examines criteria evaluating the sign, and these include adequacy, truth, and reliability. It presents the third factor is that it presents the classification of modes of discourse, and these are in accordance with the primary use of signs and modes of signifying. It presents the relations between linguistic science and general social behavior, as we said earlier on. Not just specific social behavior, but general social behavior. Okay. Part 3, which was the final of the three parts, it was three parts, was a combination of various texts, and this was all encapsulated, or these were all encapsulated under the larger title of Writings on the General Theory of Signs. And here he collated some of his work, 5 semiotical studies, and very important work that he had done over the years, which ultimately did contribute to this. And one was his work, Signification and Significance of 1964, his Aesthetics and the Theory of Signs, his Signs and about Signs, about Signs, about Signs, about Signs, his Mysticism and its Language, and the Man-Cosmos Symbols work that he had done. So in this he examined the relation between semiotics and aesthetics. So the first part he was looking at the foundations, the grounding. Then he moved to the relationship between semiotics and social behavior. And then in the third part, which is now, he looks at the relation between semiotics and aesthetics, whatever aesthetics means. He discussed that aesthetics are a science and a sort of, and he moved on to discuss the science of aesthetic science. He then examined the relationship between the aesthetic and sign analysis. And finally, he looked at the ways that art, and you'd expect art to have a part in this because it's aesthetics, and aesthetics is, frequently connected to art, whatever art means. So he looked at ways, or examined ways that art functions as an aesthetic sign. So this was his general theory of science.